You wake in a city that reeks of incense and sewage. Rome. Marble gleams under the sun, yet damp cracks spit out rats and flies. The crowd moves like a living theater. Senators in white togas, gladiators scarred into silence, courtesans drowning themselves in perfume so sweet, so heavy, it tries to bury the stench of rotting flesh. Here, love was never tenderness. Here, love was a mask, a contract, or a public spectacle. You feel that every caress was watched, every sigh measured, every embrace poisoned by the need to survive. They call Rome the cradle of civilization, but between its columns, what flourished was the terror of being exposed, stripped, reduced to flesh without power. Marble concealed the sweat, passion was currency, and desire was a trap. The city stares at you with 1,000 painted eyes on frescoes and statues, but none see your truth. Rome is eternal because it learned to dress its rot in beauty. And behind every romance, behind every banquet, flowed an invisible river of blood. In Rome, desire was not whispered in secret. It was traded in open silence. Marriages were stitched together like treaties, forged not by tenderness but by calculation. A bride's dowry was a weapon, a husband's name a ladder. To love in this city was to gamble with one's survival. The elite spoke of passion as if it were marble, something to be carved, displayed, and broken when politics demanded. A wife could be abandoned to secure an alliance. A lover could be flaunted to humiliate an enemy. Intimacy was no sanctuary. It was a marketplace where bodies carried prices, and desire became the coin that purchased favor, influence, even safety. You realize, here, affection was never free. Every embrace was measured in risk, every kiss a calculation, every betrayal inevitable. Rome built its empire on conquest, and even the heart was a province to be exploited. And soon, from these cold transactions, emerged the infamous affairs that would define its legacy. You stand in the torchlight of the Palatine, clothed not as yourself but as someone dead. The crowd stares, waiting for the emperor's command, and you feel the weight of Rome pressing down. They say Nero once loved Poppaea Sabina, but after her death he carved his grief into you. Your body is no longer your own. It has been cut, reshaped, mutilated until you resemble her ghost. You are Sporus, but tonight you're also Poppaea. The ceremony is no whisper of devotion. It is theater. Senators, soldiers, and slaves alike watch as Nero lifts the veil, declaring you his bride. You do not hear applause, only the silence of a city complicit, the silence of survival. To refuse him would be death. To obey is to bury your soul alive. Historians write of this grotesque union as if it were scandal, but beneath the marble rhetoric lies something darker, a love that was not love, but domination. In Rome, even desire wore chains. And in your humiliation, we glimpse how passion, twisted by power, became cruelty's most intimate mask. The cruelty was never concealed. It was staged beneath marble arches and torchlight. In Rome, private pain became public theater. The city learned to feast on humiliation as if it were bread, to applaud betrayals as though they were victories. Desire was paraded, wounded, and mocked, and the audience clapped until their hands bled. You realized the crowd was not innocent. It was the engine. Without their gaze, the spectacle would wither. But Rome demanded performance, and every scandal fed its hunger. Love was not intimacy. It was choreography, rehearsed and repeated until the line between affection and cruelty dissolved. In their applause, silence was murdered. In their laughter, dignity was buried. You stand among them, unsure if you're a victim, accomplice, or both. And as the torches burn brighter, you sense another shadow approaching, another affair destined to unravel beneath the eyes of a city that never looked away. You hear a name whispered like a curse, Messalina, empress, wife of Claudius, draped in jewels that could not hide her hunger. The sources say she slipped from palace to brothel, competing with prostitutes until dawn, her body a battlefield against the emptiness inside. Some called it lust, others called it madness. But what you see is a woman devoured by a void so vast that no embrace could ever fill it. Each night became a wager, each conquest a desperate denial of silence. Rome laughed, Rome watched, Rome whispered, yet no one stopped her, because her ruin was entertainment. In a city where desire was currency, her hunger was too reckless, too visible. What began as secret indulgence turned weapon, twisted by rivals into accusation, then into sentence. When her betrayal reached Claudius, she did not stand as empress, but as spectacle, no longer adorned, only stripped, no longer desired, only condemned. And in her fall, the city learned again that love in Rome was never love at all. It was theater sharpened into a blade. The bedchamber in Rome was never sanctuary. It was an arena, and every pillow hid a dagger. Husbands betrayed wives with calculated indifference. Wives betrayed emperors with whispered alliances, and lovers betrayed each other for nothing more than survival. What should have been refuge became the stage where the most intimate wounds were inflicted. Messalina's hunger was only one mirror of this truth. Behind every curtain, another drama unfolded. Silken sheets concealing conspiracies, whispered vows curdling into strategies. To lie beside someone was not to be safe, but to be exposed. The warmth of the body beside you carried the chill of threat. And so betrayal was not exception, but law, the unwritten contract that bound Rome tighter than marriage itself. You feel it now, that in this empire, love was not protection. It was surrender to the very hand that would undo you. And already, another story stirs in the shadows, ready to strike. Not all stories in Rome were born of cruelty. Some carried the weight of devotion so fierce it became unbearable. You see Hadrian, emperor of an empire stretched to its limits, and beside him the youth Antinous, whose presence softened the iron of rule. Their bond was no secret. It was a flame Rome chose not to extinguish. Statues would later capture the curve of his face, the serenity of a boy adored by power. Yet love in Rome was always shadowed. In the year 130, on the waters of the Nile, Antinous drowned. Accident, suicide, or ritual sacrifice, historians argue, but Hadrian's grief was undeniable. The emperor who commanded legions wept like a man undone. And from his sorrow, he did what Rome had never seen. He made a mortal into a god. Temples rose, cities bore Antinous' name, his image scattered across the empire like fragments of devotion. But beneath the marble and worship was grief, raw and unrelenting. For Hadrian, love had slipped from embrace to eternity, leaving him with statues instead of touch, prayers instead of presence. Love had become religion, because death had taken everything else. Grief became Hadrian's empire. Where others built triumphal arches, he raised shrines to a boy swallowed by the river. Across provinces, statues of Antinous bloomed like flowers carved in stone, idealized, eternal, untouched by decay. What Rome once consumed as spectacle, Hadrian preserved as divinity. You walk among these silent faces of marble and feel the weight of devotion carved into every curve. This was not the cruelty of Nero, nor the hunger of Messalina. This was love refusing to die, even as the beloved lay beneath the Nile. Yet even here, tenderness bore its own torment. For every temple was a wound, every prayer a confession that grief had conquered even the emperor. Rome applauded cruelty with laughter, but here it bowed in reverence to sorrow. And for a moment, the city seemed to believe in love, not as contract, not as performance, but as mourning sanctified. Yet shadows never retreat for long, and soon the empire would turn again to darker appetites. The chalice trembles in your hand, and you wonder if the wine is sweet or fatal. In Rome, love often ended not in embraces, but in poison. Wives accused of slipping venom into their husbands' cups. Husbands silencing rivals with a tincture invisible to the eye. The dinner table became a battlefield where betrayal was swallowed with roasted figs and honeyed wine. Whispers carried faster than the fumes of incense. She poisoned him for his fortune. He poisoned her for her dowry. Families undone by a single sip. To recline beside someone in feasting was to gamble with your breath. Cicero himself wrote of the trials where noble women stood accused, their beauty a mask for powders hidden in rings and vials. Here, desire was distilled into liquid death. A kiss could taste of almonds, a feast could be a funeral. In Rome, to love was to drink, and to never be certain if the next swallow would be your last. She was born beneath the shadow of empire. Julia, daughter of Augustus, the man who wrapped himself in virtue to cloak Rome's corruption. Yet her heart refused the mask he demanded. Her affairs spread like wildfire through the city, whispered in taverns, muttered in forums. For Rome, they were scandal. For Augustus, they were betrayal written in flesh. He had fashioned himself as guardian of morality, legislating fidelity as though decrees could bind desire. But when Julia defied him, his image trembled. And so, to protect the mask of Rome, he shattered his own blood. Exile became her sentence. Banished to bleak islands, stripped of family, stripped of freedom, stripped of the warmth of touch. In her fate lies the cruel symmetry of Rome. Desire tolerated in whispers, celebrated in emperors, but punished when it endangered the illusion of purity. Julia's body bore the weight not only of passion but of politics, sacrificed to preserve the marble façade her father built. The sea becomes her only witness. Julia walks the barren shore, waves gnawing at the rocks like teeth. Once the jewel of Rome, she is now a shadow, condemned to silence. In exile, there are no lovers' whispers, no crowds to cheer or condemn, only the endless rhythm of water echoing her loneliness. She feels her body not as hers, but as a vessel of disgrace. The empire carved its sentence into her skin, branding her with shame no distance could erase. To love in chains is to ache without touch, to carry passion as a ghost that feeds on memory. Here, beneath the salt wind, Julia's tragedy grows heavier than marble, for she reveals what Rome always hid. That power may conquer nations, but it cannot master the human heart. And in that defiance, punished by loneliness, her story bleeds into the darker wounds yet to come. You hear the whispers first, carried like poison through marble corridors, Caligula and his sisters. Drusilla most of all. Historians debate. Was it truth or venomous propaganda meant to blacken an emperor already drowning in madness? Yet in Rome, the whisper itself was enough. The rumor alone mutilated intimacy into corruption, love into spectacle. Imagine the weight of such a gaze, to embrace not as kin, nor as lover, but as scandal incarnate. Every touch, whether real or imagined, became theater for a city that fed on outrage. You, the listener, are dragged into that chamber, forced to ask, what happens when affection, twisted by power, ceases to belong to the body and becomes property of the crowd? Drusilla died young, yet Caligula mourned her as though she were a wife, not a sister. Some say he demanded divine honors for her, as if love could be sanctified even in its corruption. But in the end, whether truth or invention, the story itself reveals Rome's darkest hunger, not for intimacy, but for the desecration of it. In Rome, truth mattered less than the whisper. A glance, a rumor, a servant's murmur in the dark could weigh heavier than fact. Affairs were sometimes real, yes, but often the accusation alone became the sharper blade. Love itself could be twisted into evidence, a kiss recast as conspiracy, a meeting as treason. You realize the city thrived on suspicion. Senators employed spies, rivals bribed slaves. Gossip slipped through taverns faster than wine. To desire openly was to hand your enemies a weapon, to let them paint devotion as betrayal. In this empire, silence was safety, but silence also a slow death. And so, Rome became a labyrinth where intimacy was never private, where even the thought of affection could condemn. The whisper was both poison and proof, leaving every heart defenseless. And from this web of suspicion, darker stories of passion and ruin would continue to bloom. Beneath the marble palaces, another Rome breathed in chains. In the shadows of villas and fields, slaves clung to each other in moments stolen from cruelty. Their love was fragile, a spark hidden in the folds of night, where overseers' eyes could not reach. To touch was to risk punishment, yet to deny that touch was to surrender to despair. Imagine the embrace of two bodies marked by lashes, whispering vows that could never be spoken aloud. No dowries, no banquets, no contracts. Only the trembling insistence that even in bondage they were still human. Their intimacy was rebellion, a wound stitched together by tenderness. But Rome rarely allowed such defiance. Families were torn apart at auction blocks, lovers separated by coin, devotion dissolved into commerce. Still, they reached for each other, because to love, even briefly, was to remind themselves they were more than property. In their hidden embraces, the empire's cruelty met its quietest resistance. In Rome, pleasure was never gift, it was debt. Every kiss carried a price. Every embrace risked exposure. Every desire was balanced against punishment. For the elite, it could mean exile, disgrace, the slow erasure of one's name from marble. For the powerless, it could mean lashes, separation, or death. The city wrapped its passions in luxury, banquets, perfumes, silk, but beneath the satin weighted iron. To seek joy was to wager survival, to gamble with the empire's appetite for spectacle. What seemed indulgence was always shadowed by consequence. You feel it now, the tightening of the net, the inevitability that no body was safe from Rome's hunger. For in this city, pleasure was not freedom. It was the stage upon which tragedy was rehearsed, again and again. And soon, the most grotesque performances of all would step into the torchlight. Rome preached virtue while drowning in excess. Statues of modest matrons lined the forums. Edicts proclaimed the sanctity of marriage, and Augustus himself had written laws to guard morality. Yet behind closed doors, emperors feasted on lust, senators bargained with mistresses, and generals paraded slaves as trophies of desire. The city performed chastity in daylight and surrendered to appetite in the dark. Philosophers like Seneca warned of lust's chains, writing that passion enslaves the soul. But their words rang hollow when echoed through halls dripping with wine and silk. Hypocrisy became Rome's true theater, virtue staged for the crowd, indulgence hidden behind curtains, until rumor tore them open. And so every affair, every whispered betrayal, grew sharper under the weight of contradiction. To love sincerely was dangerous, to desire openly fatal. The empire demanded purity in public, yet rewarded corruption in secret. And within this double life, intimacy could only fester into tragedy. The wedding veil in Rome was often a shroud. Arranged marriages, sealed with vows before the gods, carried not promises but threats. A wife's dowry could make her target. A husband's ambition could turn his hand to murder. What began beneath garlands and hymns often ended in blood pooling across marble floors. Husbands poisoned cups to inherit fortunes. Wives conspired with lovers to slit the throats of emperors as they slept. The very words spoken at the altar, to honor, to cherish, became ironies sharpened into blades. In Rome, matrimony was not union but performance, a pact where affection was irrelevant and survival uncertain. You hear the echoes of those vows, twisting into screams, and realize the truth. In this empire, love was indistinguishable from violence. Each promise concealed a dagger, each embrace, the possibility of betrayal. And the rhythm of Rome quickens now, as if racing toward the inevitable collapse that every blood-stained union foretold. What happens when desire grows larger than the body that holds it? In Rome, it became poison seeping into the veins of empire. Affairs were never only whispers in darkened chambers. They were earthquakes that cracked dynasties apart. A lover's betrayal could unseat an emperor. A wife's scandal could fracture alliances. A mistress's ambition could tilt the balance of power itself. Desire devoured more than flesh. It consumed thrones. The fate of armies and provinces turned on kisses stolen in torchlight. Rome's history was not just written by battles and laws, but by the tremor of secret embraces, by the venom of passion spilling into politics. And so you see, in this city, intimacy was not private sin but public danger. Love affairs were weapons disguised as longing, daggers hidden in silk. When desire devoured, it did not stop at the bedchamber. It feasted on the empire entire, leaving blood where once there had been touch. Walk through the ruins, and you will feel them still. Rome's ghost lovers. Nero and Sporus, frozen in a grotesque parody of marriage. Messalina, her hunger echoing in every shadowed corridor of the Palatine. Julia, staring endlessly toward the sea of her exile. Hadrian, clutching marble faces of Antinous, worshipping stone because flesh was lost. Their stories bleed from the cracks of broken temples, whispered by statues with eyeless stares. Love in Rome did not soften, it scarred. It did not heal, it haunted. Every embrace became an echo, every vow a curse that outlived the bodies that spoke it. You realize these romances were never private. They became Rome itself, etched into its stones, preserved as warnings. What the empire called passion was often humiliation. What it called love was often grief wrapped in cruelty. And so the ruins do not sleep. They murmur still, reminding you that in Rome, affection was never tender. It was a grotesque memory, a ghost that refuses silence. The torches burn out, and what remains is silence. You stand among ruins where marble once gleamed, where vows were spoken, where betrayals dripped like poison into the veins of empire. Rome, the city of masks, has crumbled, yet its shadows still linger, carved into broken columns and nameless graves. You see the pattern now. When love is chained to power, it ceases to be love at all. It becomes theater, humiliation, weapon. It devours not only the body, but the city itself. Nero's grotesque union, Messalina's hunger, Hadrian's grief, Julia's exile, all threads in the same tapestry of desire twisted until it consumed its weavers. This is the final warning. Civilizations fall not only by swords and fires, but by the corruption of their most intimate bonds. When affection becomes spectacle, when passion becomes currency, when the heart itself is sacrificed to power, collapse is inevitable. The empire is dust, yet the lesson endures. Look closely, and you may see Rome's reflection still, alive in the hunger, the hypocrisy, the silence of our own age.